a Latino legislator could represent black voters in just the same way. So when we need to design our research to evaluate the effects of this descriptive representation, we need to hold those constituency demands constant and look at a shift when the same district shifts from having a white to a black legislator or from a black to a Latino legislator and see if that brings any additional change in legislative behavior or whether legislators, regardless of their race, are simply representing their voters and doing the job that the electoral connection demands of them. This also points out the first looming cloud on the horizon that shows that winning one political seat may not help a minority group in the overall political system. Right? No matter what bills the legislature introduces, right, those bills need to pass in the entire legislature. So David Epstein and Sharon O'Halloran's work pushes us to look at the role of minority legislators in winning coalitions, right? And so these are a couple potential maps they draw of two issues where you have a division between legislators who represent minority vote, a minority ethnic or immigrant group, and legislators who are members of the majority group. If district lines are drawn in a way that maximizes the representation of minority groups, or if minority voters are residentially segregated in a way that allows them to capture many seats, they could, in this potential world, capture many seats and have lots of people who become losing voters in the legislature, who are always on the wrong side of the majority vote in the legislature and never have an opportunity to be part of the winning coalition. But in another system, so if legislative districts are drawn in a different way, or if a population is more dispersed and captures fewer seats, they may have fewer members of the legislature, but also more potential allies. Potential allies who are white moderates or other ethnic groups who they may form coalitions with, and actually be a smaller group who's on the winning side of votes in the legislature. So the implication of this from our research designs is we should look not just at success in gaining legislative seats, but also use the technology that we have to map the space of legislators on the ideological spectrum in all of these countries to look at where those members are in a legislative coalition once they're elected. The second looming cloud on the horizon for minority representation when it comes from dense population is something we heard a lot about from the speakers yesterday. And it's the idea, most famously postulated by VOP, that when some minority group is densely packed in an area, that the other voters in that area feel politically threatened by that group. Right? So Key was specifically talking about white voters being most virulently racist in areas where there were more black voters or potential voters. And this is a map that was on the front page of the New York Times after the election, and it shows the change between Democratic presidential gains in 2004 and 2008. So the bluer areas are areas where Barack Obama did better than John Kerry. And you see this is true very much in the West, all throughout the Eastern Seaboard, and indeed in much of the country. But there were some areas in which John McCain did better in 2008 than George Bush did in 2004. And these were these areas of the South that very often had high black populations, right? So even though this is some of the empirical support for this idea is debated, there is some clear evidence these days of this white fear hypothesis. That when one group is densely packed, that voters in the surrounding areas react against this minority group, right? And this could work. This could work for, say, blacks in an area that's very densely Latino, or different ethnic groups are reacting against each other. It can also work at the level of a legislature. So, in some of my research done with Gerald Gamm at the University of Rochester, we were looking at a particular type of legislation, a bill that just affects a legislator's own district. So these are bills that are sort of harmless to everyone else in the legislature, and the real question is, why would anyone vote against them? And indeed, this type of legislation passes at very high rates. So we looked at 13 state legislatures starting in 1880 and in 20-year intervals thereafter. and coded, identified all these bills that only affected the legislator's own district, and coded how they did in the legislative process. And most of them, they passed at very high rates. Computer sort of ran them over, but they passed at 70, 60% rates in general. But when these bills are introduced by a member of the delegation from the largest city in any state, so New York City or Chicago or Detroit, they actually pass at much lower rates. So throughout, consistently across American history, they pass at about 15 to 20% lower rates than bills from just someone in some other minor city in the state or from a rural area. And so the question is, why do state legislatures discriminate against the biggest city in that state? And reading the literature, one of the hypotheses involved this group threat. And the idea is that these major cities in any state, like Paris, that they are portals for immigration. And they look very different from the rest of the state. They are, in a very clear, visible way, more foreign than the rest of the state. And so some of this legislative discrimination has its roots in social discriminations against the immigrant groups that are based in these areas. So one of the things we coded was the percentage of the population in the state's biggest city who were immigrants compared to the state's population overall. Right? So what these graphs show is that in Minneapolis, well, this is a state where 29% of the people in Minneapolis were immigrants, many from Sweden or Finland, but the state was overall very immigrant. So 30% of the people in the state overall were immigrant. Similarly, Richmond had very few foreigners, but so did the state of Virginia overall. So these are states where the big city looked like the rest of the state, and we'd expect less discrimination against bills that come from the big cities. By contrast, Chicago was this portal for Eastern European and immigrants, and was much. And the city had 35% of its population was foreign-born. The state as a whole had 20% of its population. San Antonio, much more Mexican-American than the rest of Texas. New York, much more Irish and Italian than the rest of the state in 1800. And so our hypothesis was that the size of this gap between the foreignness of the state and the foreignness of the city, as that graph grows larger, there should be more discrimination against the city because it's viewed as a threat and a group of people who are very different. And in fact, in a multi-level model which controls for both the idiosyncratic factors in any state at any year or in any legislative session, and also controls for the content of these bills and the other political dynamics. So with all these statistical tools, what we're comparing is two identical bills introduced under identical political circumstances. If that bill is introduced by a member of a delegation from a big city that's 1% more different in its population, it'll pass at only 88%. It's only 88% is likely to pass. So the passage rates of these bills shrink as that gap between what the city looks like and what the state looks like grows larger in its immigrant population. And this has been true. This effect is constant, it turns out, across American history. So this was discrimination against European immigrants at the turn of the century, and now it's discrimination against mostly against cities that have many Latin American or Asian American immigrants these days. So this persistent threat, or at least political difference posed by immigrants in the U.S. leads to an anti-reaction in the rest of the legislature as a whole. The final looming cloud on the horizon that I want to talk about is an idea introduced by Bruce Kane up there about the two different ways in which the American political system represents voters. So since the 1960s, the Supreme Court has mandated that all of our legislative districts have the same number of residents. Right? They each need to have the same number of people living in them. And so in that way, they give equal representation to residents. Right? Whereas our elections for